Okay, the final speaker of the afternoon is another giant in the field, Richard Karp. Dick has also had an exceptional career in industry and academia. After a Harvard PhD and almost a decade at IBM, he spent most of his career at Berkeley, where he's currently a university professor. And I just learned also that he's now the director of the recently announced Simons Institute for the Theory of Computing. Dick is well known for many landmark contributions to several areas of computer science, including the theory of NP completeness, the max flow problem in networks, and Boolean satisfiability. Most recently, he's been working on algebraic methods in molecular biology and genomics. Dick's list of honors is also quite long, and I'll just mention a few things. He's received the National Medal of Science, the Kyoto Prize, and the Turing Award. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Thank you, Vince. I've got to turn on my mic here. There's the switch. Can't seem to find the switch here. Oh, yeah, okay.
There we go. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm very pleased to be here to join in this celebration of the life and work of Alan Turing. Princeton has been the birthplace of leading computer scientists who were the heroes, who were my heroes when I first entered the field. The math department at Princeton in the 50s was a hotbed of novel ideas related to computer science in discrete optimization, game theory, complexity theory, artificial intelligence, and so forth. So Princeton has had a special place in my birth as a computer scientist. I'd like to explore with you a certain idea which suggests that the theory of computation will play an increasingly important role in many scientific and engineering fields and in society as a whole. We use for this idea the metaphor of the computational lens, the idea that many phenomena in the physical, biological, social, and engineering sciences involve information processing at a fundamental level and can be studied through computational models. And I'm not referring to simply the use of computational resources to solve well-posed problems in these various fields, but rather I'm talking about the use of ideas from the theory of computing to study fundamental processes which are information theoretic and information processing in their inherent nature. So historically, the physical sciences have mainly analyzed systems in terms of physical transformations and the expenditure of energy, but there's a complementary viewpoint where, especially when you're looking at complex systems with many parts, you want to understand them in terms of the logic of the interactions among those parts. So what I'm going to do is take a kind of historical survey through the development of this idea, illustrating it in many different fields, discussing the extent to which it has been adopted at various times in the past, and even touching on some of the sociology and the politics of the field as we go along. And I'll be talking mainly in relation to my own experiences and the circle of people that I've been involved with at Berkeley and elsewhere. So let's go back in history to Berkeley in the 70s and 80s. In a way, it was a wonderful period for us. The fixed points of the theory group at Berkeley during that time were Manuel Blum, Eugene Lawler, and myself. We had other distinguished people who came through, but whom we weren't able to retain for such a long period. And the activities that we carried out were along fairly classical lines, well-defined areas within the confines of the theory of computation. So we worked on NP completeness, on many different kinds of algorithms, online, parallel, and randomized algorithms. There was a lot of development in cryptography and program result checking. And we were lucky enough to have a wonderful flow of students and postdocs, many of whom are listed here, people who moved on to populate the computer science departments of a number of research universities. A particular landmark a little later on was the work on the PCP theorem and the related concepts having to do with hardness of approximation. And these were done in two seminal papers that involved Sanjeev Arora from Berkeley, also Rajiv Motwani, as well as their co-authors. So that was the history up to approximately 1992. And in the 90s, while we continued to work in the classical areas, independently, several of us took new directions that had to do with the relationship between the theory of computing and other scientific fields. My colleague Jean Lawler and I got involved in computational biology, initially with problems in genomics, string matching, genome assembly, physical mapping of genomes, DNA computing. In 1995, various circumstances led me for a period of time to the University of Washington. Part of the reason I went there was that Washington at that time was very well developed comparatively in genomics and related areas. They had a piece of the Human Genome Project. And so I went there to serve as an apprentice. It was an interesting time because I would sit at the feet of the postdocs who were working in the lab, and I would ask them questions and try to understand what they were doing. And then when they were looking for jobs, they'd ask me to write a letter of reference for them. In 1999, I was called back to Berkeley, and one of the reasons was that Berkeley was starting to move finally in computational biology. We formed a computational biology center studying a number of different areas: genomes, phylogeny, population biology, molecular machines and regulation, protein structure, with 30 faculty, of whom about 15 were hired during the past decade. So there's been tremendous growth, and I've continued to work in that area, illustrating this theme of the computational lens, that you can understand processes in biology, such as the operation of living cells, by viewing those processes as essentially executing algorithms. Around the same time, another colleague, Umesh Vazirani, got interested in quantum computing. In 1992, he discovered Feynman's 1982 paper, Simulating Physics with Computers. And thinking about it, he wondered whether the fact that it's so hard to simulate a quantum system with a conventional computer might imply that a quantum computer might have an advantage in such simulations and other tasks. And in 1997, Bernstein and Vazirani wrote a seminal paper in quantum complexity theory, and they've continued to work in quantum computing, Umesh and his colleagues, ever since. And one of the interesting aspects that Umesh has pointed out is that part of the game in quantum computing is to build an operable quantum computer and to study what can be done with it. Oops, what can I do about that? I don't know how to get it up here, but I can work with this. So Umesh pointed out that another equally important task is to understand whether quantum mechanics as formulated is actually valid and correct when you start working with very complex systems involving large numbers of entangled particles. So one possibility is that the study of quantum computing might need to lead to a revision of quantum mechanics itself. Another colleague, Alastair Sinclair, also got involved, drank the Kool-Aid, you might say, and started getting involved in the connections between theory of computing and a scientific field, in his case, statistical physics. And he discovered that physicists and computer scientists are investigating the same questions from different angles and using complementary techniques. So, for example, many of the issues in statistical physics involve the mixing rates of Markov chains and other stochastic systems. And the study of the mixing rates of those systems also is involved in various randomized algorithms. So a couple of the seminal papers included a paper by Sinclair on conductance and the rapid mixing property for Markov chains. I do know how to spell Markov, my apologies. The approximation of the permanent resolved, which involved the analysis of the mixing rate of a certain Markov chain. And a few years later, using similar techniques, Sinclair studied a problem in physics, polynomial time approximation for the Ising model in statistical physics. Eventually, the physicists, the computer scientists, and the statisticians all got together in a program in 2005 at the Mathematical Sciences Research Institute at Berkeley, and were able to understand one another's language, which has helped greatly in the further progress of the field. And what one sees in this connection between statistical physics and the theory of computation is that at a very deep level, they're really doing the same thing. So that the randomized polynomial time algorithms for computing the number of perfect matchings in a bipartite graph developed by Jerome Sinclair and Vigoda are based on Markov chain Monte Carlo, a technique that physicists invented to sample the states of a system of interacting particles. Another example is that survey propagation, the best known method for solving random satisfiability problems, combines ideas from statistical physics with ideas from machine learning about belief propagation. So here again, we see that the theory of computation can be enriched by casting its lens on problems in the natural sciences. Yet another colleague, Christos Papadimitriou, began, just touch it. Thank you. I need a little help in these technical areas, as you can see. I do know how to operate a dishwasher. I had to do that recently when my girlfriend went out of town for a few days. So Christos Papadimitriou, after working in NP completeness and many other classical areas, began getting interested in the internet and the application of game theory to mechanisms that occur on the internet. And he took the approach that the internet, and I would say the web also, had to be approached empirically rather than, let's say, axiomatically or through an a priori mathematical model. So the way Christos put it, we had to approach the internet with the same puzzlement with which previous generations had approached the brain, the cell, and the market. And some of the seminal papers by other colleagues outside of Berkeley included the work of Nissan and Ronan, who opened up the whole area of algorithmic mechanism design, the study of algorithms for economic mechanisms. And there's also the famous seminal work by Roughgarden and Tardosh, where they studied something called Brace's paradox, which shows that routing of vehicles through a network can get worse when another road is added to the network. And they studied a whole bunch of problems having to do with how badly selfish routing, every man for himself, performs compared with the social optimum solution. And in a sense, we could say that the web may be supplanting the Turing machine and its relatives as the cardinal model for many parts of the theory of computation. The web is, in a sense, much richer and more complicated because the internet and the web are simultaneously computational, social, and economic. They support new modes of interaction and communication, and we all know that there are many novel algorithmic problems having to do with mechanisms on the web, ranking of web pages, reputation systems, design of auctions, and so forth. So what we see here is that almost independently, four of us and others at Berkeley began to drift a little bit from the classical confines of complexity, cryptography, and algorithms and logic to areas where we see a rich set of problems arising in either the natural sciences or the study of very complex engineered systems. And there are other colleagues who also have similarly tried to shine the computational lens on problems in the natural sciences or even the social sciences. So Kleinberg's famous work on the small world phenomenon, a paper by Kempe, Kleinberg, and Tardosh on maximizing the spread of influence through a social network, and Les Valiant's monograph where he tries to analyze the fundamental limitations of the neural networks that the brain presumably is composed of. These are all examples of the computational lens applied to problems in the sciences, giving rise to rich new questions for the theory of computing. So in, I guess it was 2001 that the four of us mentioned here got an NSF grant to pursue these various threads having to do with connections of theory of computing to the natural sciences. And in 2002, we ran a workshop where we got people from many various places to come and talk to us about genomics, statistical physics, quantum information processing, experimental economics, and other areas, as well as the theory of computation itself. And we've been mining this territory ever since. And last May, we ran a kind of bookend to this, a counterpart to bringing the themes of the original workshop up to date in connection with our bid to get the Simons Institute located at Berkeley. We ran another workshop that explored similar areas brought up to date, and ranging also into genetics, cognitive science, some areas of pure mathematics and statistics and machine learning. A little bit later, Caltech, quite independently of us, took a very similar attitude, a very similar viewpoint. They basically decided that it was important for the mission of Caltech to bring information science on a par with the physical sciences that they're so famous for. And the president of Caltech at the time that this institute was kicked off was the biologist David Baltimore. And he said the following about this effort. He said, some say biology is the science of the 21st century, but information science will provide the unity to all of the sciences. It will be like the physics of the 20th century. Information science, the understanding of what constitutes information, how it is transmitted, encoded, and retrieved, is in the throes of a revolution whose societal repercussions will be enormous. So they were taking a view perhaps even broader than the one that we were taking at Berkeley, bringing fields like information and communication theory into the area as well. And they founded a pretty large-scale program that had 4 foundational areas: biological circuit design, social and information sciences, physics of information, and mathematics of information. And to unify things, they required that each postdoctoral researcher that they brought in would have to have 2 mentors in 2 of these 4 areas. Before I get to the next slide, I should mention that similar ideas were being developed by people at Microsoft. And in 2005, Microsoft produced a report called, what was it? Microsoft 2020 Science, or something like that. Word 2020 appeared there. And it was quite similar in its viewpoint to our notion of the computational lens, except that it sort of commingled 2 slightly different streams. It commingled the idea of the lens as an approach to formulating problems with the more traditional kind of computational science for solving models. But the bottom line for them also was the growing influence of theory of computing on all of the sciences. In 2005, there was an upsurge of alarm in the theoretical computer science community about the growing difficulty of getting even a meager NSF grant. And Sanjeev Arora, Avi Vigderson, and Boaz Barak from Princeton wrote a white paper pointing out this difficulty. And this eventually led to the formation of a committee by the Guild of Theoretical Computer Scientists in the US, the SIGACT group. A committee whose task, to put it bluntly, was to make the case for more money for a theory of computing. We became a lobbying group. And as part of that, we continued to emphasize the computational worldview that I've been describing here on various scientific fields. And NSF-funded exploratory workshops that took place at Princeton and Caltech in 2006. And there, a whole range of additional scientific subdisciplines came forward with needs for modeling using the tools of theory of computing. Neuroscience, evolution, synthetic biology, DNA computing, nanoelectric circuitry, nanoscale self-assembly, and even such unexpected areas as the study of the flocking of birds or the analysis of the history of the universe. So these workshops brought together people from a wide variety of different fields who had some expectation that their scientific fields could give birth to interesting problems and benefit from interesting problems of a theoretical nature in computing. There was a terrifically nice workshop report that unfortunately didn't get published but can be found on the web if you search on computational worldview. And they raised a number of sample core problems. There's a crowd of quantum particles different from a few particles. In other words, when we study the interactions of a significantly large number of qubits, maybe phenomena will arise that haven't been observed before in less complex experiments. Non-equilibrium dynamics, not just Markov chains, but nonlinear dynamical systems, and studying not only the convergence, the stationary solutions, but the non-equilibrium solutions. Algorithmic game theory, we've already talked about. New models of the brain. One of many key areas in biology, modeling of regulatory processes in the cell, and also the study of social networks that was pioneered by John Kleinberg and others at Cornell, were some of the open problems that were raised in this report. I think there's a slide that I skipped. Yes, going back here for a moment. There was an interesting interlude when shortly after the SIGACT committee began its lobbying activities at the National Science Foundation. We submitted a white paper proposing a new program of research on the theme of the computational lens. And this actually got people in the SCIES directorate at NSF quite interested, and they started pushing on this theme, and it led to a quite large congressionally mandated program called the Cyber-Enabled Discovery Initiative, which ran for about 5 years. That's the good news. The less good news is that, of course, bees like to find honey, and directorates all over the NSF became interested in exploiting this program. And what happened was that it became a kind of catch-all for anything that combined computer science with another field. So what we thought was the elegant theme of the computational lens became somewhat dulled, but nevertheless, it was a good development because the program did support a lot of research. Interestingly, though, the underlying ideas that we had set forth didn't get much currency. In fact, we submitted a proposal to this initiative referring to the computational lens on the assumption that the reviewers would know exactly what we meant, but they became confused. What is this computational lens? And they turned down our proposal, so a little bit unfortunate. Late in 2009, there was a meeting at the Simons Foundation. This is a private foundation run by the highly successful hedge fund manager Jim Simons and his wife Marilyn, and they had been supporting research in autism and also supporting a lot of mathematics work, but they decided to deepen and systematize their work in the mathematical sciences. And so they brought a group of people together in a 2009 meeting, including Avi Vigderson, Margaret Wright, and myself, together with mathematicians and physicists. And at that meeting, we proposed the creation of an Institute for the Theory of Computing. Math and physics already had a number of institutes. The number in mathematics is now 7 or 8, I think. But there was none in theoretical computer science. And this idea was accepted, and the request for proposals went out in 2010. And the request for proposals described the goals in this way: that the new institute will be focused on research in theoretical computer science, broadly defined, including its theoretical core agenda as well as its joint endeavors with mathematics and the sciences. So part of the viewpoint that led them to support this effort was that they wanted to see this outreach to the sciences. So eventually, after a while, Berkeley was quite recently selected to be the site of the Institute. And our main goals are to create a leading international center for research in the theory of computation. So the goal is to serve the whole international community. To continue to strengthen the field's core and foundations, we're not going to abandon logic, complexity theory, cryptography, and the other intrinsically important core areas. But additionally, we want to broaden the outreach of theory of computing to these other scientific fields. Here's a list of some sample programs that we drew up to give an idea of the scope of the Institute. And I won't read through all of these, but I think you can see that it's a mix of relatively classic topics in the theory of computing, semi-definite programming, discrete analysis, arithmetic combinatorics, with other topics that relate the theory of computing to the sciences, physics, evolutionary theory, quantum computing, and cognitive science in these cases. So that's the end of my historical survey, but in whatever time remains, I see that I have quite a bit of time. Let me go through a few vignettes of some of the emerging areas. We came upon some of these areas simply by talking to lots of people at Berkeley as we progressed towards our goal of getting the Institute at Berkeley. We talked to people across the sciences, and we discovered some very interesting things. That there are people out there who are very knowledgeable about the techniques of machine learning and the theory of computing and have really novel problems. So here, for example, is a quote from Joshua Bloom, who's one of the leaders in cosmology and is constantly carrying out experiments which scan the night sky. He says, by the end of the last decade, robotic telescopes were established as effective alternatives to the traditional role of the astronomer in planning, conducting, and reducing time domain observations. By the end of this decade, machines will play a much more central role in the discovery and classification of time domain events observed by such robots. So what's going on here is that they're constantly observing and generating images and scanning those images to look for interesting events. So there are so many of these images that are being produced that the search for interesting events has to be automated. And they have to grade these events according to how promising they are, whether they're anomalies of no interest whatsoever, or whether they're leading to the discovery of a black hole eating up a star or a new planet or something really interesting. So the point is that this is a kind of very rich online decision theoretic problem where these large numbers of images have to be automatically scanned and evaluated according to their promise, and if they score high enough on their promise, then part of the effort of the telescopes has to be directed toward them. So it's an excellent application of online algorithms, streaming, and the like. Another area that's becoming a science through computational analysis is advertising. So we all know that companies like Google put a lot of effort into optimally placing ads next to web pages that are retrieved in Google searches. So an interesting problem was formulated. It turns out not to be the one that Google is guided by currently in conducting auctions for these advertising slots, but it's something that they seriously considered. And the question was, how could Google optimize its revenue when each time a search is done, implicitly there's an auction in which bidders will state how much they're willing to pay to get a particular slot next to that web page. Google doesn't actually set the criterion of optimizing revenue, but they consider doing it, and it leads to the following problem. How does a search engine company decide what ads to display with each arriving query to maximize its revenue? And this turns out to be a generalization of a problem that we worked on just for fun. Online bipartite matching is a special case of this problem. And we showed that an online algorithm achieves a competitive ratio of 1 minus 1 over E. And by a much deeper analysis, these authors were able to show that a similar competitive ratio holds for this more complicated problem. Another important development is in computational game theory. The cornerstone of non-cooperative game theory is the Nash equilibrium. A Nash equilibrium in a multiplayer game is a joint choice of mixed strategies such that no player, knowing the mixed strategies of the other players, is motivated to change. So it's a kind of particular notion of equilibrium. And traditionally, historically, game theorists have taken the position that rational play implies Nash equilibrium. This is subject to review because the notion of a perfectly rational, intelligent player is under some siege at the moment in economic circles. But this is the traditional way that optimal play is characterized, even despite the fact that a game may have millions of Nash equilibria. So it doesn't necessarily uniquely specify the action to be taken. Nash's famous result is that every game has a Nash equilibrium, but may have many. But Daskalakis, Goldberg, and Papadimitriou proved that computing a Nash equilibrium is an intractable problem. For the specialists, it's a PPAD complete problem. And so this leaves a dilemma. Is it possible that the normative behavior of a market should be Nash equilibrium if we can't efficiently compute Nash equilibrium? Or as Kamal Jain put it, if my laptop cannot compute a Nash equilibrium, how can the market do so? So that's another recent development, mixing fundamental problems in the theory of computing with the domain of game theory. Of all the sciences, the one that probably has the most scope for computational modeling and the analysis of novel computational processes is biology. Les Valiant gave a talk related to biology this morning, of course. And there are algorithmic problems and biological systems to be analyzed at many levels. Learning in neural networks, figuring out the algorithm that the immune system executes in trying to fight off an invading microbe. It's not an algorithm in any traditional sense. We don't even know exactly what the computer is that executes this algorithm, but we know behaviorally that the immune system is making these decisions. Specialization of cells during embryonic development, understanding of cancer as an algorithm that's gone wrong somewhere. If we could understand where the algorithm went wrong, we could figure out how to intervene with cancer. Collective behavior of animal communities, flocking of birds, self-organization of ant colonies, and all the way up to evolution, the grandest problem of all, comparing and testing the plausibility of different theories of evolution. A particular area that I've been interested in is computational molecular biology, where we're basically trying to understand a cell as a collection of little machines, where these machines consist of proteins and other macromolecules that are interacting with one another to perform the processes of the cell in response to signals coming into the cell. So here's a rather romantic description of the challenge of this field. A quote from the University of Washington biologist Gary Odell. He says, "We can approach understanding how the whole genome works by breaking it down into groups of genes." I would say proteins, but genes and proteins are sometimes thought of interchangeably for some purposes. Breaking it down into groups of genes that interact strongly with each other. Once researchers identify and understand these network modules, the next step will be to figure out the interactions within networks of networks, and so on until we eventually understand how the whole genome works many years from now. So basically, the idea is that a cell at a certain level of description is a kind of causal network, which may be stochastic or deterministic, and involves the interactions among large numbers of proteins. I'll conclude by one final vignette, an area that I've been working in for a while with my students. This has to do with the concept of a protein module, a set of proteins that interact together as an aggregate to perform some cellular function. So we would like to understand the interactions between the proteins. There are tens of thousands of proteins in human, for example. And we'd like to understand which subsets of these proteins interact strongly and perform some common function. So we can summarize what we know about the interactions between proteins by what's called a protein-protein interaction network for a particular organism. There's one for human, another for fruit fly, another for the mouse, etc. Where it's formulated as a network in which the nodes correspond to proteins and the edges to physical interactions between proteins. And so, given the protein-protein interaction networks of maybe several species, together with side information about whatever is known about the functional properties of proteins, we would like to search for protein modules, strongly interacting groups of proteins that perform a common function. These protein modules tend to be conserved across species, so if you have a protein module in one species, then it's likely that there's a module in some related species that has the same proteins or proteins that evolved from a common ancestor with the proteins of the first module. You also want your modules to contain proteins with similar functions, and typically a protein module should induce the set of proteins should induce a connected subgraph of the protein interaction network, and it should have low conductance. If it's going to operate as a module, it should be fairly insulated from the other proteins in the organism, so we'd expect to have a much higher density of interactions within the module than from the module to the outside. So we get a combinatorial problem which involves looking at these criteria across several species at the same time, juggling a number of requirements that the proteins have similar functions, that the modules in different species have the same or so-called orthologous proteins, similar proteins, and that the connected graphs that they induce have low conductance. So we've been mining this ground. It's full of NP-hard problems, and we have to rely on heuristics. One last thing I'll say is that all of this area where we're looking at the modeling of problems arising in the sciences from the viewpoint of computation is intimately involved with massive data sets. That big data is really the battle cry certainly in industry and also in anywhere where scientific analysis is conducted. The data sets are getting huge, both in the commercial areas and in the physical science areas and in biology. And any serious attempt then at constructing mathematical models for these data-rich situations will involve machine learning techniques for extracting insight from very large data sets. So the big data dimension is a very important one in all of the areas that I've talked about. So with that, I guess I'll stop. And
So I find the notion of, sort of a computational lens on the natural world extremely exciting. I am a little chastened by the history of sort of previous enthusiasms along these lines, general systems theory and nonlinear systems to be two of the ones that have kind of crashed on the iceberg of the actual difficulty in getting traction on the natural world. In comparison, something like differential equations has had incredible staying power in ecology, for instance. So what's the argument that this attempt to sort of bring these mathematical models to the natural world is going to be more like differential equations and less like general systems theory?
Everybody hear the question? So the question is, why will the approach I'm describing be any more successful than previous attempts at general systems theory? The answer is simple. We are not proposing general systems theory of any kind. When we work on these different areas, we're motivated by the same desire to model processes in these areas, but there's no algorithmic or mathematical model that covers both, for example, statistical physics and computational game theory. In other words, the models within the particular areas are very particular, very specific. And there's no attempt at any, broad, overarching theory. They're just as specific as other models in the sciences. So there may be, it's possible that I'm overselling this approach, but it wouldn't be because of the excessive generality.
There's one right here.
Yeah.
When you apprenticed yourself to genomics,
Yes.
what was your biggest surprise? And did you have trouble communicating with people in other areas?
Oh, good question. Very, very good question. I started to work in genomics because I thought that I had some relevant skills in combinatorial algorithms, and I saw that there were a lot of problems that could be formulated as NP-hard problems, and so I thought that I would simply walk in and sweep the field before me. But it's not like that at all, for many reasons. One is that it's very difficult to extract the right problem definition. And biologists, with a few rare exceptions, aren't used to the kinds of precise modeling that we try to do in theory of computing. Secondly, most of them are not at all interested in how you do it. They're interested in getting a well-engineered piece of software where, by their own subjective standards, they trust the results. It doesn't have to do with optimizing some objective function that we may choose. Furthermore, you have to sell yourself to some group to convince them that it's worth wasting their time on people like us. So it's really quite difficult, and I must say I haven't been so good at it because I really like to do what most of us in this room like to do. We like to jump to a model, analyze it as well as we can, try to prove a theorem. That's not what's needed in order to have an impact in this field. So those are some of the things I learned. On the positive side, biologists know how little they know, so unlike physicists, they're not arrogant.
So, question over here?
Just a comment. Many times in your talk, you reminded me of the famous essay by Eugene Wigner, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics and Physics. The same models are appearing in different fields, the same underlying mathematical models.
Yeah.
That should come as no surprise to anybody who read Wigner.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there are cases. I mean, one that comes to mind immediately is the affinity of statistical physics for certain problems in the probabilistic analysis of algorithms. That the same kinds of Markov chain convergence results apply to both. So on the other hand, I remember that Jack Schwartz once wrote an article called "The Pernicious Influence of Mathematics on the Sciences," which essentially, as I recall, said that premature mathematization can be very bad. So it cuts both ways.
So that was a very exciting and broad vision of the computational lens. And I was very excited to hear about the Simons Institute and how broad it was going to be. I just wanted to ask a little bit about how broad it's going to be, right? Theory often breaks up into Theory A, computational complexity and cryptography and the like, and Theory B, semantics and programming languages and logic and the like. So you talked a lot about Theory A. Will it also include Theory B? Because there are a lot of interesting Theory B problems facing us with...
Yeah, everybody know what
I could
Theory
list
B is?
loads, but maybe I'll just ask the question.
Yeah. Theory B, for historical reasons, refers to the areas that are more closely related to logic and the analysis of programs and programming languages. We're perfectly open to it. We have Moshe Vardi on our scientific advisory board. As you may know, Moshe speaks up if he sees anything wrong. So we'll have to have a conscience about that. I mean, basically, we'll be open to anything that fits under the broad scope of the theory of computing if enough good people are willing to come together to develop a program for it. So theory B is fine.
I'm really happy to hear that. But I mean, how many people are on the board? Just one of Moshe against all the rest of you?
Well, that's embarrassing. It's 17 to 1. Yeah.
Your first vignette spoke about how robotic scanning has pretty much taken over astronomy observations. I wonder, there seems a natural analogy there to applying robotic scanning in medical imaging, and analysis of medical imaging in health. I wonder, is there much development going on there? Is it well advanced?
I don't know much about medical imaging, but it doesn't have the real-time aspect, right? Normally, you're not taking a new observation every day. So astronomy has this additional complication that you have to decide, where to look in the night sky every night and which things to follow up. Whereas if you're doing radiology, you normally take images once from a person and then analyze them. So in some sense, it should be easier.
Say one last question, right here.
Thanks. I haven't remarked at how things have changed in 40 years. I had suggested 40 years ago we could learn a lot from biological natural systems and for computer science, and I was pretty much burned at the stake for that because, well, you could be a heretic. Everything was going to be built up from set theory, logic, and Turing machines, and built on top of that. And it's refreshing to see how there's back and forth now between the different sciences, and graduate students here in electrical engineering might be studying biology, or they might be in 5 other departments. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, the action is very much at the boundaries between disciplines. I think that's well recognized now.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay.